Welcome to episode 326 of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. I am your host, Morgan, aka Bon Diesel, and this week we'll be talking about WB Games is shutting down multiple studios, Dragon Age The Veilguard is being given away, Monster Hunter Wilds gets reviewed, and a whole lot more. Before we get started, subscribe to the Baunfire Gaming Podcast on your favorite podcast app. Leave a review on Spotify or iTunes, and subscribe to the Bon Diesel YouTube channel to get all of my videos, including for this podcast. Thank you to everyone who supports as YouTube members and Twitch subscribers. If you're interested in supporting this show and all of my other content, please check out the links in the show description. You can now leave a comment on Spotify episodes. You can leave a comment on YouTube videos, or you can join my Discord to chat with other listeners about all of the news and more. Check out that link in the Linktree link below. Gaming news, let's jump into our main story. WB Games is shutting down Player First Games, WB San Diego, and the legendary Monolith Productions, the makers of Fear and the Middle-earth games. They are also ending production on the Wonder Woman game. Jason Schreier was on Kinda Funny's Gamecast, and it was really kind of an accidental Gamescast for them. That's their weekly show, or one of their weekly shows, sometimes daily. And he was only on there for their news show, and it turned into a bigger podcast. So what was it? He mentioned a couple things that they had recently removed their Nemesis system from the Wonder Woman game. If you don't know what the Nemesis system is, it's from their previous big games for Monolith of the Middle-earth games. And this was a system, and it was cool, that throughout the game, you would go to these like strongholds, and there would be like a boss, or I don't think it was always strongholds. I think that was, you could also just run into gangs of enemies, right? And they would have a leader, and they would have like lieutenants, and they'd have a whole ranking structure, which had its own UI, and you could see the whole ranking structure of your enemies, of the antagonist. And what would happen is, say you ran into one of these groups and you killed the leader. Well, later on in the game, you would run into that group again with the surviving members, because they would run away or whatever if you killed them, enough of them. And one of the lieutenants, if they lived, would now be the leader, and they would like call you out specifically and mention things that happened in previous times that you had met them. And I believe that the various survivors of these encounters would even have like battle scars or like replaced limbs and things like that, if that was the case, if that's what happened in your previous encounters. And it could go fairly high up. I did play one of these games. I can't remember which one, and I won't pretend like I played it a ton, but the system on its own is really interesting, and it's kind of legendary in the gaming industry, especially on the commentator side, like people like myself, mostly because Monolith or WB Games has a patent for it. And so no one else can do something that even really sniffs that. Back in the day, or some of the recent Assassin's Creed games have had like a really, really basic version of this, but I think it's not even like as intricate. It's extremely simple comparatively, but that's really been Monolith's more like recent legend, is that they have this system that everyone wishes you could put into other games, but you basically can't because of this patent that doesn't expire for another, it's like 10 years or something. So that's them. And they didn't intend on putting that into the Wonder Woman game that they were working on. At one point they were, and it was going to be a thing where instead of killing them or them rising in the ranks, you would try to turn foes into friends, and then they would help you later in the game. So it sounds like it was going to be a similar system, but not exactly. The other part, one of the things he said about Monolith, is that they had no interest in making another Lord of the Rings game. So you would think that doing another one of these Middle-earth games would be a fairly sure bet to at least have some success, right? And that's not what they wanted to do, which, I can appreciate to a point. He also talked a lot on that podcast about leadership at WB Games. and how, some previous leadership just basically seemed to not understand gaming at all. They were just other entertainment industry folks who just happened to end up in that position. He did talk about, I think it's the current leader of it, um, talking about how they understand that, game development isn't a linear process. It doesn't, we're like, to a point, things like movie making, TV shows, development, things like that have, are fairly procedural about the way that they're made. That, certain things should take this long. You can plan things out a lot. Where with video games, the example he gave is that that there's this understanding that, you can be making a game and you can have a level built and you can have a mechanic that your player character is going to use against the antagonist characters, right? Well, say you work on this mechanic and it doesn't work at all. Say it's a traversal mechanic where you can pull yourself close to enemies that are high above or something. And you've designed the world to use that system as often as you can, realistically. Well, you take that mechanic out because it's just not working. It's not fun or whatever, the reason is. Well, now you have to go back and redo that world. And so what Schreier talked about is that what he was impressed by was this person seemingly kind of understanding like that's just how games get developed. And you know that's probably part of why games are so expensive to make and things like that. It's probably a different discussion. But how he mentioned that he knows leaders of other and publishers and studios and stuff who have been there for decades and still don't really understand that. They still expect games to be made very procedurally and to just you get this done, then you get this done, then it comes out, and not realizing that video game making is, I've compared it. If you've listened to my show for long enough, you will have heard me talk about how game development, I think, from what I've been told, is way more like a band making a music album, where it's very free flowing, and if you change the lyrics, it may mean you have to change the melody, or you may have to change, you change instruments, you do different tuning, you do all kinds of different things. You bring in backup artists, or you don't have singers and stuff, where in one thing impacts everything else, and that can be pretty substantial. And video game development is very similar, and a lot of people in the industry, even if they've been in the industry for a long time, don't seem to understand that. So I will say, out of all this doom and gloom, because obviously these studios getting shut down, especially Monolith, who's been around forever, like 30 plus years, sucks. There was at least a little bright light, I guess. There was also mention of the existing or the surviving studios. WB Montreal is working on a Game of Thrones game. TT Games is releasing a Lego game next year, which I think was news, because Schreier wouldn't say what franchise the Lego game is going to be. So there's that. And then Rocksteady is working on a new Batman game. Just as an aside here, WB's like big remaining studios, I would say, is Rocksteady. But the people who made the old Arkham games and stuff like that, and they've more recently released, Rocksteady did the Suicide Squad game, which wasn't loved. And I believe Montreal is the one who did the the game where you played as everyone but Batman, Arkham Heroes or something like that. And those have been pretty big disappointments, and especially with Rocksteady, you just have all these people being like, why don't you just have them make another Batman game? And that sounds like what they're doing, but we'll see how that works. Rocksteady is talked about a lot like BioWare is, of being a ship of Theseus, where, the name is still there and they have their IP and things like that, but that, many of the devs are gone. It's not the same studio anymore. I also believe it's actually like BioWare to a point where there actually is a decent amount of veteran leadership still there. But it's not the narrative that gets talked about, and that's fine. I also will admit I don't know a ton about their specifics. There's also the story going around about how James Gunn is supposedly in talks with NetherRealm, who is another WB game studio, the Mortal Kombat people. They didn't, in all these articles, they basically don't even get talked about because they're probably as safe as any studio can be there, because Mortal Kombat is very consistent. But supposedly James Gunn is talking to NetherRealm and Rocksteady about DC film collaborations. If you don't know, James Gunn, who made Guardians of the Galaxy, all three of those movies for Marvel, as well as some other movies, has taken over the whole DC movie universe and is making a bunch of movies trying to do kind of what Marvel did 15, 20 years ago now. And to have this, this universe of movies with Superman and Wonder Woman and, all Batman and all of the characters you expect. Um, this is tough because games take like 2 or 3 times longer to make than movies do. One thing that I've learned a lot about in recent years is how quickly movies actually get made once they get started. Obviously, I'm a Division fan, and if you're one of the people who's hung with me since those days, we've all been waiting for the Division movie to eventually get made. Ross and Thurber, we're still paying attention to you, at least a little bit. But it literally has just never started. But it sounds like once movies actually begin production, they film relatively quickly, and then it's a ton of editing, obviously, especially nowadays with computer generated graphics and things like that. But the problem is that if there's a movie that's going to come out in 2 or 3 years, this isn't back in the PS2 days or the Xbox 360 days where you can just kind of pump out a game in a year to match up that movie and you're happy. Some of those games were even good, even though most of them were pretty awful. So this whole collaboration with the film side and the game side, I almost would say like make it very vague and not make it very dependent on each other, because that's almost certainly just going to end badly, or at least that's my opinion. So sucks with WB Games. Of course, you hate seeing it's, once again, this is our month's tragedy in the game industry of some big studio or multiple studios getting shut down, big projects. The Wonder Woman project to me was always a little strange. I think the Wonder Woman character is really cool. She's part of the big three for WB, which is, or for DC, which is Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. But I just, probably for various societal and cultural reasons and stuff, Batman, Superman seem to be the bigger poles of those three. And having the whole game just for her was an interesting choice. And it's not even that I think it was a bad idea. It's just, my thing is, if you have this publisher and you have this group of studios who's struggling to get games out at all, who the games they're putting out, many of them aren't doing well, and in fact are doing badly when it comes to reviews and sales. Maybe you go to the classics, and then once you have success there, you move to others. Now, it's also worth remembering that WB Games, and I forget which studio, had also a year or two ago now put out Hogwarts, which is a game that didn't get much critical acclaim. I think partially because of the politics behind it. I also think the part that people don't acknowledge as often is that it sounds like it was like an interesting game, but it wasn't really that great. But that fandom is just unique in that they'll buy anything that comes out. And it sold like 30 plus million copies. And so it kind of seems like with like Suicide Squad and some of these other games, WB just thought like, hey, we'll just do that again, not realizing that they have a very unique situation with the Harry Potter franchise and the IP. So sucks for all these studios. I hope all these devs find new jobs. I can't even imagine what it's like trying to find a job right now, because you've got these layoffs happening, you've got the studios shutting down, you don't have any venture capital money in the industry right now. No one's opening new studios right now. The studios that are around are all like counting their days, hoping that they're able to get out of the game before their publisher shuts them down. But even then, even if you put out a game, and then even if it does fairly well, you could still have layoffs, like with Marvel Rivals, even though that situation with NetEase is a little more complicated than that. It's just there's this like weird vibe in the industry right now, and I'm just like someone who covers it in this little tiny itty bitty corner of the industry, of the commentary industry, which is a subset of a subset, right? And even I feel uneasy. So, I think about it all the time, like what it must be like to be one of these devs, whether you've spent your whole career doing this stuff, or if you're, getting out of college, or, entering an internship or something. Like, it must be so disconcerting to get into this industry right now. But then it's still a lot of people's passion, right? And like, I don't want to discourage people from doing that. Obviously, I want cool people making cool games for a long time. I'm one here, hoping that BioWare has time to make another Mass Effect game, and I hope it ends up being really good. And I hope Ubisoft Massive is able to get out a Division 3, and that it's super cool, even though those prospects, have varying levels of confidence going forward, right? So, um, the stuff sucks and it's not going to end, and we're going to probably be covering this every month for the foreseeable future. And the shutdowns and all this stuff has always been a part of the industry. It does seem worse than ever, and I think it's especially frustrating because, like, back in the day, I guess it was at least more predictable. Of like, AAA studio would spend 2 or 3 years on a game, they'd put it out, and then they would just fire a bunch of people. And at least back then, it seemed to follow more of a pattern. um and I think that, when you see some people's resumes and stuff, you can see that that's kind of how it went. Like, if you look at a bunch of veteran devs, in the industry right now, or maybe who have left it recently, you'll see that either they stayed at one place for like 25 years, or they went to a new place like every 3 or 4 years. And I guess, like, that still probably sucked, but I guess, like, when you were making a game, you probably had a pretty good feeling of like how that situation was going to end for you, and so you could start planning your next steps, or whatever. Where now it just seems, now they're spending 5, 6, 7 years on a game, and then it can just get canceled. Like this Wonder Woman, those Monolith devs, there's a fair chunk of them who probably have long resumes and lots of experience, and that will be a blip on their resume, even though a pretty substantial one. But you also probably have a bunch of devs who have only ever worked there, who started there 5 years ago or 4 years ago. Wonder Woman was the only credit they've ever worked on, and it's not even going to come out. So, and then that gets into a whole other part where, a lot of times these studios won't allow these, especially the artist, to reveal art that they did, or models they did, or animations they did on Wonder Woman, even though it's shut down and nothing's happening with it. Often they still aren't allowed to show the things they did for copyright reasons or NDAs or whatever. And then even worse, the people who worked on the engine or on the infrastructure, or the sound designers, or the voiceover people, and all of that, the voiceover artists. That game surely had people doing voiceover for it after that many years. Surely they were at least in the early stages of recording voice lines and stuff. And all of that work is just dead now. And we keep hitting the story over and over and over again. And it's frustrating and it's disconcerting. And I hope it turns around at some point, and I wish I was more confident that that was going to happen. Moving on to some other stories. Dragon Age: The Veilguard is already on PlayStation Plus Essentials in March. This has sparked off quite the conversation. That's why I made it my. I didn't really want to make this the main story because there's not that much meat there. But I did want to at least discuss this because the reactions have been fairly predictable. And per usual, I feel like I have kind of the contrarian take on it. Well, either you can look at it as contrarian or maybe the more realistic take, but I'm a little biased, so I won't tell you what to think about it. My thing with this is that it's interesting because you can look at the Metacritic and OpenCritic scores and see it's in the 80s, right? You can look at any of the reviewers that I find to be the most non-political, not even political isn't the right word, the most unbiased and the most objective, right? I think ACG is a reviewer that's in that category. And you can look at the reaction by like mostly normal people, right? And see that Dragon Age: The Veilguard was good. At the very least, it was fine. It was okay, right? It has good combat. It's a pretty game. I still hate that one of the biggest things about the Veilguard that isn't celebrated is it came out. It's a complete game. Now, it sounds like there were desires to do DLC and expansions, and that EA just wasn't going to allow that. I've said for quite a while, long before release, that I had a feeling for quite a while now that EA was just trying to get this game out and recoup something from a pretty rough development cycle. And it came out and it reviewed well and it was generally liked and it's a pretty good game. It's just not the 10 out of 10 that EA probably wanted. It's not the 10 million unit seller EA wanted. And one of its biggest issues is it wasn't really the game that seems like a lot of Dragon Age fans were wanting after all this time, or hoped for. And I say that because, even in my own community, or, in the ones I've kind of observed, I'm not a Dragon Age fan. I've never played Origins or 2. I don't like Inquisition. And so to me, I went into this kind of as like an outsider, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very normie friendly, which is what I am to Dragon Age. But many of the reasons why that is the case also seems to be why a lot of that existing community didn't accept the game and doesn't really like it that much. And that sucks. But I can appreciate it. The things I've seen, even from my fairly, I tried to be more knowledgeable on the three previous games, so I kind of understood somewhat what was going on in this new game. And from that, I can pick up on a lot of the things, the way they treated past characters, the way they either addressed or didn't address events that happened previously in the game, especially ones that would have been a choice that you would have made in previous games, that wasn't respected, or it was just ignored, or canon was set in ways that people maybe didn't love. To me, one of the most striking things, even as someone who wasn't a fan of Inquisition and hasn't played the previous games, is what they did with how some of the characters look in Veilguard was very interesting. I think the character is Dorian, that they made him just look like completely different than in Inquisition. It's just some strange choices there, but I'll try not to judge too much. Um, and we have all this conversation about Dragon Age: The Veilguard. At the end of the day, I think the best way to describe it is a really good game, that should be a good example to the industry of releasing a complete, in my experience, basically bug-free game that has pretty good characters for the most part and a pretty good story. And that should be the example, right? The hottest take I'll have about Veilguard is that the third act of Veilguard, the finale, I guess, is the best BioWare has ever done, at least for me, from what I've played. I love the Mass Effect games. It's obviously my main thing. I love the finales of all, really, four of those games. I'll even say Andromeda, the third act of it is fine. Um, I still think that the third act of the Veilguard is extremely good. I find the beginning and the middle to be kind of middling, no pun intended. Um, and they were fine. I definitely felt the length of them. Where the third act I thought was great. I couldn't stop, and and I finished it in a couple playthroughs because I, was probably playing too much. Um, so when I see this story pop up and I see the conversation around it being put on PlayStation Plus Essentials, I don't see it as negatively as some people have. I will say I expected it on Game Pass first. I'm surprised it's on PlayStation's equivalent, kind of equivalent. I have seen people say that it's coming to the EA Play soon, which is part of Game Pass, Xbox's Game Pass. So there's a pretty good chance that that's kind of why it's on PlayStation Plus first, just because of timing. But to keep in mind, I believe this PlayStation Plus Essentials, like this won't just be these people's game um, while they have PlayStation Plus. This is them getting the game like entirely. They won't have to pay for it. The most reasonable, like more negative reaction I've seen to this is people who may have bought the game in the last month or two, who probably are, on the PlayStation, obviously, who happen to have PlayStation Plus or have the right level to get this, would obviously be a little miffed, and I can appreciate that. The weirder take I've seen is that this is like proof that it's a failure or something. I really hate, and I saw, and you see this commentary all the time, and I'm trying to get better about ignoring it. But people portraying, the 1.5 million sales in 3 months as like a disaster, and like publishers always have hyperbole with this stuff. They wish every game they sold 50 million copies in the first week. Now that's obviously an exaggeration, but them wanting 3 million copies in the first 3 months was probably a fairly arbitrary number that some exec or math, whoever the CEO is, I always forget his name, Wilson, I believe Andrew Wilson, maybe. uh it's probably just a number someone came up with. Now I'm sure there's some metrics, like how much the game costs for them to develop and them trying to recoup those costs, and all of that factor in. um but I just I don't think there's a lot of knowledge around about how good or bad is 1.5 million really for this game in that time period. Here, the whole conversation here with PlayStation Plus Essentials is that this must mean that Dragon Age just isn't selling any copies at all anymore, at least not on PlayStation. So that's why they're willing to do this. And that may be kind of true. I can't imagine it's selling a million copies a week and they're doing this. It's also worth considering that kind of like if you buy a car new and one day you decide to sell it, well, do you sell it, after a few years when you still owe money on it, but it's still worth more, or do you wait longer? That's what they're gonna that's what they have to do here with the game, right? When putting it on Game Pass or PlayStation Plus Essentials and stuff, the longer it's out, the less they're going to be willing to pay for that. And so my guess is that they hit a sales figure or a sales rate that they, were okay with doing something like this. And PlayStation offered enough money that it felt like it was worth it. At the end of the day, this is probably a pretty significant cash infusion for EA slash BioWare. And I still think that, especially with the sales numbers not being as high as they wanted, the goal probably from EA and BioWare is to just get this game to have paid for itself. I don't know, and I don't think they've said how much it cost them to make Dragon Age The Veilguard. It was probably quite a bit of money, especially if you factor in the previous iterations of it that came about before they even started full production on it, going back to, I think, 2018 or so, when full production didn't actually start until, I believe, 2020 or 2021, one or the other. I just don't think this is as bad as it is being portrayed by some people. And it's a simple fact that some of the people in this conversation are the anti-DEI, anti-woke, Grums, Indie Mayan, JT Smash losers who, like, what I think is interesting is when you see people commenting on this on social media or Reddit, it's always, I think, smart to click on that person's profile and see what else they're talking about. If they mention something about the Veilguard or BioWare or any of this stuff, and their other conversations they're having on their platforms are about all kinds of different things or different games, or they're positive about some things and negative about others, that's probably someone throwing out a legit opinion. What I think you'll find is pretty often that these people who are obsessed with this stuff and crapping on the Veilguard or BioWare or whatever are almost always people who only talk about that. And that sucks because those aren't, those aren't people really being part of discourse or conversation. So, I saw a lot of this going on. I saw a lot of people talking about it. It just kind of is what it is to me at this point. So I'm hoping that this cash infusion, and I assume one from Game Pass as well, gets them to a number with the Veilguard where it doesn't seem like it's, like a financial disaster for EA. I suspect it's not. But that it's, enough to keep BioWare going, not just for the next Mass Effect, but hopefully for more games. In my biased hope, more Mass Effect games, but we'll have to wait and see. Monster Hunter Wilds released, and its reception has been a little mixed, but overall pretty good. It has an OpenCritic score of 89. I like to use OpenCritic for games that are multi-platform because it puts all of the reviews together, unlike Metacritic. They've had 1+ million players on Steam, over a million players since it released, basically, but a under 40% satisfaction rating on there. That's mostly due to performance issues on PC, but there's also, if you've checked out some of the reviews of the game, at least some people are complaining about some extremely simplified mechanics in the game, which has been a positive or a negative depending on who's talking about it, and that there's basically no end game. Even as someone who's not a fan of the Monster Hunter games, I can tell you just from covering their releases that the mechanics complaints or happy stuff and the lack of end game at release sounds like it's basically a complaint about every single Monster Hunter game. So I suspect they'll expand on that stuff or get it into a spot that more people are happy about. The simple fact is that it got enough actual reviews to have almost a 90 on OpenCritic, and it has a ton of people playing it just on Steam. Obviously, that's not counting PlayStation and Xbox players as well. So you're probably looking at any given time well over a couple million players, which you would assume means that they've really quickly sold 2, 3, 4 million copies already. Something tells me that the publisher is going to be just all right with that, and we will probably see more games of this ilk sooner than later. Speaking of games that just keep on chugging despite their quality, or however you want to look at it, Pokemon Legends Z to A was announced during Pokemon Day this week. What was interesting about this, I made kind of a joking social media post on my various platforms saying that you could convince me that this game was a GameCube game, and I stand by that. You definitely could. Obviously, I'm exaggerating to a point that it's very clear. It's run at 1080p or whatever, maybe. It's a Switch game, so maybe like 720p or 480 or whatever. But it really is. It's just I'll just never not be amazed by it's portrayed in different ways, right? Like the Nintendo fans and people who are probably more reasonable than me portray it as Nintendo and Pokemon and Nintendo players, that they know that it's about how fun games are, not how they look, and blah blah blah. And that's cool. Like, genuinely, that's cool. But I still am not convinced that it's not kind of like Stockholm syndrome, where people are just big fans, and so they're just so biased that they just kind of close off any criticism of the way these games look and perform, and how they just aren't modern games. Like, they just simply aren't. And I think the bigger issue with some of the more recent games that Pokemon has put out on Switch, to be completely clear, this is me speaking from watching reviews and stuff like that of people who are very positive about these games. But like the most recent big Pokemon game that came out on Switch, you can tell that there was just such a desperation to be like, this is a cool game, but it's hard to ignore the fact that these games run at like 15 FPS in many parts. And that even on, and it's not because they look amazing, they look terrible, at least in my opinion, and they also don't run well. And so no matter how fun that game is, I worry, maybe for no good reason, that like Nintendo just kind of takes advantage of these people, like kind of believing this, well, it doesn't matter how good it runs or looks. Their games are just fun. And obviously they are, especially their more high profile titles, the Mario games and so on. But it's just like, you see this game and it's doing some cool stuff. It has like real-time combat and stuff like that, which people have been asking for forever from Pokemon. Obviously cool stuff that people are going to buy this game for, no doubt. And I'm sure on the Switch 2 it will run at least a little better. I still have my suspicions that the Switch 2 won't really actually be that powerful, but we'll have to wait and see. And this game will probably run fine on that. It'll probably be a good solid 720p 40 FPS. I'm kind of joking. It's just interesting. And I did find it funny that the CEO of the Pokemon company came out and said, like, well, if we want to have our 50th and 100th anniversaries, we have to stay agile and mobile and stay, creative with our games. And it's just like, my man, like you're making games that, from a purely visual and performance point of view are ancient at this point. And you just can't convince me that, even with the Switch 2, that suddenly we're going to start getting these games. Like, I'm not looking for a Pokemon game that's, realistic, that has like a realistic aesthetic and everything has perfect grass textures and tree textures and leaves that move in the wind. And, I'm not looking for an Unreal Engine 5 Pokemon game, right? I want it to look kind of cartoonish and to have that aesthetic, but, not the way it is now. But we'll have to wait and see. During this, they also did announce, this is more personal to me, that the card game Pocket, the mobile game, is releasing a new pack, which they did today. I've maybe already opened a bunch of them. Maybe I'm supporting the problem. And that they've also hit 100 million downloads. That game, I've definitely fallen off of it a little bit, but I still like it a lot. Simply just opening packs is very satisfying. And yeah, I'm definitely part of the problem. Oh no. Another problem is over at Xbox. The head of Xbox Studios, Craig Duncan, has announced that Fable will come out in 2026. It had previously last year been stated that it was going to come out in 2025. That is not happening, and that they showed off some new footage, which looked extremely good and looked in engine, like looked in game, looked like gameplay, because it kind of looked like pre-alpha, which it is. There's definitely stuff in it, some of the combat and stuff. You can definitely tell they're trying to figure that feel out a little bit. But I thought it looked really, really good from a fidelity point of view, especially. Um, I suspect there's probably any studio will always be happy to get more time. And so this is one of those things where I suspect Xbox has a couple more games to announce for the end of this year, whether it's, State of Decay 3 or whatever else is out there that could come out to kind of fill that space. It may not be as big of a blockbuster as Fable, but you also have to keep in mind there is a 2025 Call of Duty that's always going to take up a lot of space. But I suspect pretty heavily that Fable is trying to get out of the way of Grand Theft Auto 6. Just like everyone else will. So to me, this is probably them having a calculation of giving them a few more months can only help. We get out of the way of this juggernaut game that's going to come out and suck out all the air for a while. And then they get to release this big title for Xbox at the beginning of 2026 after they already have a really solid lineup for 2025. So I am not really too freaked out by this. I think it's good. I think it's good for them to communicate the way they did, to be pretty upfront about it. And wasn't a huge fan of the Fable games, even though I think I played the second one quite a bit. They're fine. I just never got super into them. Now I probably would, today's, me probably would, but back then I was a Madden Call of Duty guy. I just wasn't into those type of games back then. So PlayStation VR2 is getting a big price cut down to $399, which I believe is around $150 to $200 off. It can be used on the PC, even though PlayStation removes a bunch of the big features when you do that. But luckily, PC gamers have already basically hacked it to get those features back. So you may have to be a little creative if you want this. I'm under the impression that for $400, this is pretty good hardware. But that I don't know. This is a strange one to me that I don't even really know why PlayStation did this, because they just haven't supported it. They probably spent a pretty good chunk of money developing this, and for all intents and purposes, that sounds like the technology is extremely good in the VR2. It's just I think they've released like one first party game for it and a couple exclusive third party games, and otherwise it's just kind of just a headset that they have already kind of pretended they don't have. So if you want a cheap PSVR 2, right now is a good time. Obsidian has claimed that they want, or that they have bigger plans for Avowed with potential DLC or sequels. It seemed the vibes around Avowed are pretty good. The reviews are a bit lower than I expected after I played it, if I have to be honest. I think it's around like an 80 Metacritic. I really feel like something like an 8.5 is probably more appropriate, but I also understand why people have some of the criticisms they have of it. Even though a bunch of the criticisms about it are really dumb and play into a lot of the stuff, similar to kind of what happened with Veilguard, even though I think Avowed may be better, at least in some ways, than that game, a game that I loved, both of them. This makes me happy to see, and Obsidian doesn't miss, basically, and to see them have another hit is really exciting. And honestly, the thing that's most exciting for me is how good and how into Avowed I was, knowing that the Outer Worlds 2 is the game I'm more excited about. I love the Outer Worlds. It was an extremely fun experience. And if, the lessons that they seem to have learned from the first game and from their previous games being played forward to Avowed, and even more so affecting Outer Worlds 2, which could come out late this year. That could be one of those games that they replace Fable with. I'm extremely excited. I'm super pumped for it. So I anticipate, I think Xbox is going to have a really interesting game showcase this summer, with a couple announcements for late this year and next year, and probably some teases for beyond that. BioWare co-founder Greg Zeschuk, is how I'm going to say it, is in the news. He said that Microsoft gave them bad advice about Jade Empire to release it on the original Xbox instead of waiting, I think, a few months to release it on the 360, which they could have made that game, much more graphically impressive and stuff, taking advantage of that power. The 360 was legitimately a pretty powerful machine, all things considered. I believe theirs was one was the cell processor. I think that was PlayStation. And then I forget what the Xbox, what their proprietary processor was. But he also stated that he intended on trying to take over leadership of EA, but that I guess some things didn't work out. I think it was the sales of, it must have been maybe Mass Effect or maybe one of the Dragon Age games or something. Kind of at one point, BioWare, I guess, was a pretty prominent studio there, which makes sense. And that he thought that maybe he could take over some leadership role there, which is interesting. And stated that EA, and it had a pretty soft stance on EA, really, when it came to criticisms. When I guess in the past he's been extremely critical of EA, but kind of pointed out that like EA will support you, but they will give you enough rope to hang yourself. And when we think about how they obviously gave BioWare time, extra time for Veilguard, there's a lot of rumors that that game could have come out a year earlier than it did. That's one of those things that's like, they made, it seems like they did give them a lot of room, but that maybe that extra room came with some negatives too of, how much better did the game really perform with that whole extra year of development, when they could have saved millions of dollars, and maybe they wouldn't have had to have sold as many copies, but maybe the game wouldn't have been as good. It's that push and pull. His commentary, it seems like it's really just popping up because of the conversation around the layoffs at BioWare and EA in general, the kind of tumultuous situation that studio is currently in, and the kind of lukewarm or mixed reactions to Veilguard. It literally seems like that's the only reason he's being talked about. He's been gone from BioWare for 13 years. He left the game industry completely. He's been doing like beer brewing or something ever since then. And I kind of don't know why he's like doing interviews and stuff. Like, as far as I can tell, he's not like opening a new studio or anything. It just kind of seems like, the IGN or someone just trotted him out to kind of throw some more fuel in the fire, knowing that hate for BioWare or EA in general is really hot right now. So I don't know. I doubt he has like mischievous intent, but I think that some of the people covering this, and especially the people getting commentary from him 13 years after he's left, are not maybe doing it for purely journalistic reasons. But that's just a hot take from me. We got Xbox suggesting that they'll be talking about a bunch of things in the upcoming GDC, including Play Anywhere titles. GDC will be taking place between the 17th and 21st of March. So that tends to get some at least interesting like podcasts and talks and stuff like that. So be on the lookout for that. And then the final story we have here is Bloober Team and Konami will continue to work together after the success of the Silent Hill 2 remake. We'll have to see what they'll work on next. Well, maybe I think it'd be interesting for them to work on an original, like a new Silent Hill game, but we'll have to wait and see what kind of reins Konami is willing to hand them. As for some content updates, I should have some more time available in March. Things are slowing down a little bit for me, or at least getting more stable. So I hope to be able to stream a bit more consistently and put out some more videos a bit more often. I was in a pretty good cadence of a couple of times a week, but per usual, I'll keep up with this podcast, especially I'll record episodes of the Mass Effect Hypecast as that is appropriate or necessary. N7 Legend and I have been trying to figure out a time that will work for both of us. We're trying to fit in one more podcast before his babe comes here in a little bit. So things get a little crazy after that happens. So which I remember kind of clearly, but also it's kind of a blur at this point. So that is where I am going to wrap up this episode. If you have any questions or feedback, be sure to comment on the Spotify episode or on the YouTube episode, or let me know on my Discord, or hit me up on social media at Bondiesel or at the Baunfire on all of the platforms. Thank you so much for listening to this whole show, and please consider supporting via the links in the show description. That is all I have for this episode of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. So, Until next time.